The reality we live in can be a very strange place. Most of the time, fact being stranger than fiction. How will we ever start to understand this reality we live in unless we question everything? Join me and a guest as we unravel the mysteries of this reality, one topic at a time. This is Inquiries of Our Reality with Shayn Jones.
What is up, Inquirers, and welcome to the expanse of deep open-minded conversation. I'm the one they call Shane, and today for you guys, I have one of my very favorite return guests. Today we have Nomar Slevik. We're going to be diving into some more high strangeness and weird stuff from Maine. He's got a brand new book out, of course, so we're going to be diving into some of the stuff for that, and we're definitely probably going to have to come back for a part 2 because I feel like we barely scratched the surface on this stuff today. But before we get into this awesome conversation, just got a couple of quick news and updates, of course. First and foremost, I mentioned on the last episode, I'm going to throw it at you again, of course. Got some brand new designs over there on the Open Minds Media merch store. One of which is this really cool campfire design where you got Sasquatch and you got an alien chilling next to a campfire, smoking a joint, drinking a beer together, just hanging out, having a good time, of course. And the other new design that I got is for a little bit more of the conspiratorial-minded people out there. It says break the mind control, and you have this really cool marionette hands with this hypnotic pattern behind it. A lot of cool new stuff over there, so hopefully you guys enjoy it. And if you guys check out those designs and you enjoy them, hopefully I will be working on some more in the future. And if you guys didn't catch it on the last couple episodes, I am still doing that free t-shirt giveaway. To enter, all you guys have to do is go and fill out this quick survey for me. I definitely would appreciate it if you guys don't mind doing that. I'm trying to grow and improve the show, figure out the new direction in which the show should go. So any of your guys' opinions are definitely appreciated and will definitely help out with making the show hopefully grow this year instead of kind of sitting in the stagnant place that it's kind of been sitting at. But of course, worst thing happens, you guys get a free t-shirt out of it. So, and you guys get any t-shirt of your choice off the Open Minds Media store, of course. And for anybody else that enjoys watching the other shows that I do, you guys can catch Bizarre Inquiries on June 6th over there on the Open Minds Media YouTube channel. And if you guys have any clips or articles that you guys would like to submit for that, just make sure you guys get them to me before that. And if you guys don't, you can definitely use them on a future episode, of course. But before we get into the show, if anyone is interested in being a guest on the show, sharing their experiences or encounters, or contacting me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can email me at inquiriesofourrealitypodcast@outlook.com, or you guys can call or text the Open Minds Media hotline, and that number is 313-364-1551. And if you guys didn't catch that, it is available down in that show description. And if you guys want to catch the show live, don't forget to go and subscribe to the Open Minds Media YouTube channel. Hit that little bell notification up in the corner, and then you guys will know whenever we happen to go live. Or if you guys are following on social media, you guys can catch the weekly schedule posted on Mondays, and it is always possible that shows may vary from that schedule throughout the week. But every single thing that I mention is all available in the link tree, which is available down in that show description. And with that, let's get into the show. Please welcome back to the show, fan favorite and also one of my personal favorites. Please welcome back Nomar Slevik. How's it going today, man?
It's going good. Thank you so much for having me back. I love being a repeat guest on some of the favorite shows that I get to go on, and this is definitely one of them. Shane, you're always awesome to talk to, so thank you for having me again.
Man, that feeling goes both ways. Whether we're talking on Bizarre Encounters or this show, man, I always know it's going to be something interesting. And it's just those minds that work together that we can get into theories, we can get into stories. Like, sure. It's just those fun conversations. You never know where they could go, but you could definitely do them for hours.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess it hasn't been too long since you've been on since last time, but if anybody didn't happen to catch that last episode, before we get into what we're going to end up talking about today, why don't you let everybody know a little bit about your background and what you do exactly?
Sure. So I'm a author and researcher and sometimes investigator of really all things paranormal, but I do have a special interest in extraterrestrial activity. And so a lot of my written work has been in that nature. My latest UFO book was UFOs over Maine, came out last year, and it's a tome of a book where it's got almost 400 encounters from the state of Maine. And we're talking everything from, lights in the sky to landed crafts, men in black, strange entities, lots of strange things. And so much strangeness happens in my own backyard that I can't stop writing about Maine. There's just endless stories, it seems like.
I was going to say the last episode we did, we touched base on a little bit of that stuff if people want to go back and check it out. But everybody I've talked to from Maine, man, it's like this continuous thing, like you said, that there's always this new strange phenomenon happening there. And even just some old forgotten favorites, like the last time you were mentioning the frogmen of Maine. And I mean, how old is that story? But it's something that's finally recirculating again because it's just one of these weird, obscure stories. And I mean, I've never personally been to Maine, but I guess for anybody that may not be familiar with Maine itself, what is kind of the feel of Maine? Is it very forest or what's kind of the feel of Maine itself?
Sure. It actually has a few different personalities, which, I'm sure like any other state, but we have coastal Maine. A whole big part of our state is on the Atlantic Ocean. So there's this whole portion of coastal Maine, and that's from southern Maine up to the down east area. So that's definitely a different vibe, kind of a chill vibe, very blue collar with people that work on the water quite a bit. And then, of course, we have the medical industry that's big all over the state. But then other parts of the state, in a more abundant part of the state, are the forests and rural areas, which is it seems like 90% of the state is that, maybe even 95% of the state. And lumber was a huge export for years, and it's kind of why Maine was important back when it first became a state, and even before that. So we've got the forests, we've got coastal Maine with the ocean, but along with the forests, we have numerous hundreds of lakes and rivers throughout the state. So that's another different kind of tourist destination in Maine. And then lastly, in southern Maine, that's kind of the more urban area. The closer you get to Boston, it's more urban in Maine. And Portland is our biggest city that's in Maine, and that's turned into a much more urban area for our state. And some even call it a mini Boston, if you will. It's not that busy, but it's certainly more urban than any other part of the state.
Well, I guess that kind of makes sense where you kind of get a little bit of a blend of a little bit of all folklore, because you got people working on ships, so of course you got a bunch of stuff coming from the water, and it being blue collar workers, they actually report their sightings, they talk about this weird stuff they see. And then on the flip side, a lot of the folklore goes in with all the lumber areas, that it was a bunch of folklore and different stories that the lumberjacks would tell of their weird things that they would see out there. So it's there's such a blend of just these hardworking backgrounds that just are enthralled with folklore no matter where they are, but you get a combination of both of them in the state, and I'm sure you start getting crossovers between the two, so there's just these constant stories that are getting floated around the state. And I mean, even on top of that, getting into a little bit more, I think, southern Maine, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't you have part of the Appalachian Trail that starts up in Maine? So you also kind of got some of the weird high strangeness, weird stuff that also comes with Appalachian Trail too on top of it.
Yeah, absolutely, man. You put it perfectly, not even having visited the state. You put it perfectly. Well done, sir.
Well, I appreciate it. And I mean, diving into, I guess, your new book, I'm assuming that with a lot of your work, you end up kind of staying around Maine. So at least with your new book, if you want to start kind of getting into it, let everybody know a bit about it. Is it based around Maine also?
It is, yeah. It's a brand new book full of about 100 more stories from Maine, but these ones are about humanoid encounters, and that's the title of it. Humanoid encounters, creatures, phantoms, and other strange entities sighted in Maine. And, I might play a little fast and loose with the humanoid definition with this book. Of course, there's cryptids, Bigfoot, Dogman, and aliens. But I'm also including pukwudgies, and I'm including ghosts, ghosts that have appeared humanoid to people. I'm throwing those stories in there. I've got a black-eyed kids chapter, pale crawlers. So I'm kind of covering the gamut with stories from in this book.
See, I got a perfect spot we got to start then. One of my main things that I always like talking about, especially when I get the opportunity, and I'm hoping that you have some mixed in here, but with Pale Crawler, you might have some mixed in here. I've always been fascinated with like the underground dwellers, or these like weird sightings that people will see around like caves of these like weird lanky pale crawler type creatures. So, I mean, if you have some of those from Maine, I'd absolutely love to dive into them, because those end up seeming to be all the really weird, obscure ones that go back to like the 1800s that, if it wasn't for just some letters sitting around, then they may have been completely lost to time, but they end up being just so fascinating because they're so like, I don't know, like Sasquatch is very real world for a lot of people because it's something that you can see. It doesn't sound so crazy as like this flying Mothman thing, but these like underground dwellers, it feels so like personal to me. I don't know. It's so close to us that it could literally be happening under our feet and we're completely unaware of it. So it's just always been a fascination of mine.
Yeah, and I completely agree. It's kind of like a new fascination or obsession to me, especially as I keep finding or keep uncovering these stories. And what I found, at least from Maine pale crawler stories, that they all happen in the woods. They come from behind trees, or they come from out of the darkness, from the inside the forest in the woods. And that's just very creepy to me, because these things don't hide well. Like you said, they're tall and lanky typically, but they're also like bright white, especially under moonlight, and that's not very good camouflage, so is the origin, are they coming up at night from the underground? I mean, that makes perfect sense. Or maybe from some of our cave systems that we have, and those cave systems are in the woods. And so once we finally see them, they seem like forest or wood dwellers, but they're coming from something even deeper or darker,
Hold on tight, guys. We'll be right back after this brief commercial break. But in the meantime, don't forget to follow Inquiries of Our Reality on Instagram and Facebook. And don't forget to check out Open Minds Media on YouTube and TikTok. I'd love to hear from you guys, so feel free to leave a comment or spark up a conversation. I love getting to know you guys. And now back to the show.
So one of the stories, a couple in here, they start with glowing orbs, and not like a glowing light in the sky or anything, but some glowing orbs in the woods. And what people end up finding out is that these aren't glowing orbs. They're eyes, and they're seeing some sort of eye shine, and it's typically because of the moon. However, some of them have been described as self-illuminating, which is kind of interesting. But this one story in particular, this woman had, and this is a fairly recent story, 2019, which is always fun to find, some more recent types of stories. But this woman had gone outside to smoke. She was living with her parents at the time, and they only allowed smoking on the porch or in the backyard. So it's about 3 a.m. She couldn't sleep, wanted to go outside for a smoke. While she's out there, she sees these 2 orange orbs in the woods. And she's like, what the hell is that? And they kind of appear and then disappear, appear and then disappear. And then the moonlight, something hits it just right. And she can see this face, this head behind the orbs. And she's like, oh, that's a person or something. And it almost plays peekaboo,
It's so creepy.
ducking in and out from behind a tree. And then on its own, it decides it wants to step out into the open. And now it's still standing in the woods, but close to the tree line, and she can see its entire body. Now, her dog is outside with her at the time, and it takes off running towards it. And she's like, oh no, now I've got to go get this dog. She's, bare feet, standing on the porch smoking. she's not trying to have an encounter like this and let alone go deal with the dog, but she can't let it go out there by itself to whatever the hell this thing is. So she chases after it. Well, lucky for her, the dog stops short and doesn't get too close. It's maybe 20 yards away from whatever this thing is. And this thing is just kind of standing there, and every once in a while it's tilting its head, looking at the girl and looking at the dog. Doesn't seem very menacing, but she described it as very tall. She's thinking 7-ish feet, spindly arms, spindly legs, and the face is really what's surprising to her. Even though it has these big orbs for eyes, the rest is just kind of like a contoured face, or where a face should be, where the mouth should be, and where a nose and ears should be. It's just kind of contoured. There's no actual features. So that's really disturbing to her. So the dog, finally, she gets it under control. She has it by the collar and she's leading it back. The creature doesn't do a thing. She gets back inside the house and wakes up her parents and tells them what happened. And of course, they don't believe her. Her dad even says it's a moose at one point. And she's like, how do you get moose from what I just told you?
Sounds like the Dover demon story too.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to mention that. That sounds like an excuse of what the Dover demon was. And I think you and I touched on this last time, either on Bizarre or this show, but Dover demon might have been one of these first, peril crawler sightings, that happened in the 70s. And, why it was short and smaller, I don't know, but that's pretty much the crux of that woman's story from 2019. She hasn't seen it since, but it scared the hell out of her.
I'd love to dive into if you have any more of these stories, because this has always been one of my personal fascinations. Because I don't know if I've ever told you, but I know I've told it a few times on the show, but my main encounter that ended up pushing me into getting into this research was a creature described like that. And I have a lot of different theories on what it could potentially be, but kind of just to summarize the story, I used to do some urban exploring back at this abandoned insane asylum called Northville Psychiatric Hospital. Okay. And so we'd always check everything out. And, we got to a point where we'd been to this place so many times that we wanted to kind of explore some new areas. So underneath there's the Northville tunnels that end up connecting way past the Northville Psychiatric Hospital and starts going into downtown Northville. And they were access tunnels at one point when the city was first built, but we decided to go down there and kind of check it out. And we end up going down to the basement. I turn to go into this cutout that's in the wall. And as I turn into that room, I hear this disembodied voice to my right side say "run" in my ear. And as I'm looking forward, there's this tall, lanky, decrepit, bluish gray skin colored creature that wasn't shaped. It was a humanoid, but it wasn't shaped like a person. It was too tall and lanky and slender. And it had this black greasy hair on the top of its head. So I ended up taking off out of this place. My girlfriend took some pictures of it, which super weird that it almost looks like an apparition more than anything, but you can definitely see the shape of the thing that we saw. But it kicked me into this whole fascination of trying to figure out what this thing was and diving into all this weird folklore and everything. And I'd always keep coming back to this idea of Wendigo, but modern interpretation of the Wendigo, it's this deer-headed being. It's not,
right.
How the natives would describe the Wendigo. So I kind of started getting pushed down this trail about all right, why are we describing the Wendigo like this when the natives would describe it like this? And I kind of came up with this theory that essentially what I believe happened was that, just like when all the colonists started coming across the country, everything that was a sacred site to the natives, they would say, this is the devil's this now, this is the devil's this. So they started retelling the stories and putting their view of demonic and paganism onto this thing, and ended up basically creating this thing that was separate from what the natives were describing. But the reason I explain that is because what I think could potentially be happening is that we have this rise of this phenomenon of skinwalkers and pale crawlers. Yeah. And what I think could definitely be possible is that what the natives were describing are exactly what we're describing. It's we rename the thing because the original image isn't what we connect with that anymore. So we essentially rename this phenomenon that's been happening forever. And there's either the side that it comes from the native perspective that maybe it is something that transformed from a human, or they just kind of created these stories around this thing because it was something they were seeing. And if that's the case, I mean, my biggest guess, just like kind of you would say too, is that these things appear like they would be underground dwellers more than anything. But this is what kind of kickstarted my fascination in these things, is this whole idea of like, I think Wendigos, pale crawlers, rakes, like we're all describing the same thing. We're just using different names for it.
Yeah. I think that's very possible and a really intelligent way to go about looking at what these things possibly could be. Yeah, that's fascinating, and that's incredibly terrifying, the experience that you had.
Remind me after the show, I'll send you those pictures so you can see what I'm talking about. You can see the perfect shape of this thing, but it's transparent, which kind of gets into this whole weird aspect of like physical versus like spiritual, or are these things coming from another place? Like, I can't think of any other explanation why. I clearly saw something completely physical in front of me.
Right.
But there's also the aspect of the disembodied voice and then the translucence to the picture, because how else would that have happened? Like, there's something weird to these things, whatever they are,
Right. And we're kind of even building our own lore around it. And talking about it so much. So, I wonder if there was some sort of manifestation thing that's happening, and tulpas are popping into existence here and there, especially in areas where they were never reported before. Certainly a possibility, or just another theory, but it also makes me think of Slender Man and how he's described in a very similar manner, only that he's like wearing a suit, and obviously you can track its origins of actually being created online, but is that a tulpa as well? Did that manifest? It's really interesting to think about. And there's, just as many people that are reporting pale crawlers and black-eyed kids and some of these more fringe cryptids or entities. Slender Man's being reported in those numbers as well, and I definitely tend to believe pale crawler and black-eyed kid and dogman stories way before I believe Slender Man stories, just from like a researcher's perspective. But that doesn't mean if somebody comes to me and is like, I'm pretty sure I saw Slender Man, I'm going to sit down and talk to them, of course, and, and get the entire story.
Well, I mean, as far as like the pale crawlers and rakes go, I mean, one possibility to the possible origin of these things could be that, almost every Native American tribe has an origin story about coming from under the ground. So clearly, like, there's this aspect of things living under the ground. So what if there was like a fraction that split off, that, there's people that went above to the surface and the rest that stayed down, and they've spent thousands of years under the surface versus us on top? Of course, it's going to evolve different. Like, there could literally be explanation of this, like, within the Native American folklore with this stuff. But I mean, weird stuff, man.
And that would lend credibility towards their skin color, and why a lot of the way they're described, at least in what I've seen in my research, is a lot of contour of a face and not so much the actual features of a face, due to evolution, or they're adapting to their environment underground for so long. They have no need for eyes.
Look at fish and stuff. Like, how many cave fish are there that develop to have no eyes? Lizards, like almost anything that's underground, either one develops to have no eyes, or they develop to have giant eyes to bring in more light.
Right. And, we may have a mix of both, depending on where these things are. Because I have some stories of no eyes whatsoever, just a fleshy face. And that's terrifying,
what's even creepier to think about too is that these things don't have a mouth or anything. That could also be explained through like adaptation, because there's a lot of like cave species that don't have mouths, and they do this weird thing where they basically will like pull stuff in through their skin. Like, there's certain fish and stuff that'll basically just swim around in water, and any like food material they'll basically absorb through their skin, and they won't actually need a mouth. So, if you're kind of taking that into consideration, like, who knows what could potentially be down in some of these caverns that, something could eventually maybe adapt to almost function the same way,
Sure.
And at that point, you're totally off on a different sidetrack of a different species. Like, it may have started at the same point, but like, this is a totally different thing now that we're talking about.
Yeah. And I also got to say, at least in what I've researched, they seem benevolent as opposed to malevolent. Even though they're creepy stories, they're scary. A lot of what I'm finding is they're kind of deer in headlight. Like, what is this entity I'm seeing? When they observe us, they're like, what the hell is that? As opposed to wanting to attack or appearing menacing in any way. I do have one Bigfoot / pale crawler story. It's kind of like an amalgamation of both of them. So it's kind of a weird creature that these kids saw, and then this kid grew up and he saw it again as an adult. But it had fur, but its skin was white, and it had a fleshy face with no features at all. So it was like this weird cross between the two. But anyways, that was also benevolent because it saw them, was like, what the hell are you? And then decided to turn around and not deal with them, kind of interesting.
It almost makes you wonder how many sightings in general could just be an aspect of these things being curious. And of course, if you see something that you're unfamiliar with, you're going to be frightened by it. But I mean, Sasquatch encounters, more often than not, it's like these things don't usually bluff charge people unless they're really pissing somebody off in their area or something's going on. So for the most part, like, we see curiosity with Sasquatch. So why can't we translate that to other aspects of the phenomenon that, as humans, we want to say that everything's either good or bad, but that's not always the case. Like, some things just have a function and just do that thing. And it isn't relevant if it's good or bad, and we just have to put that because we're viewing it from our human context. But I mean, like, who knows what these things could potentially actually be trying to do. And I mean, again, you have to kind of translate it across everything that, if you say this thing could possibly just be curious, like, why can't this thing also just be curious? Like, because it looks a little bit scarier and it's a little bit easier to deal with something that has a somewhat human face versus the uncanny valley feeling. Like,
sure.
I mean, even going into that, I mean, maybe some of these pale crawlers and rakes and all these weird, fleshy, almost human-like things that are coming from under the surface, maybe that is the origin of where all the uncanny valley stuff started. It's because we knew that these things were something off from us, but we knew that they were familiar with us, like it just felt off. Like, that's one of those instinctual fears that exists in everybody. So that means that's something that goes back thousands of years. It's not something like recent. Like, that's instinctual memory.
Yeah, that's like human origin type stuff instilled into us back in, for early man, which is wild that these things could go back that far. Could they be ancient? Why not? I don't know.
See, the way I kind of view it is I feel like the food chain is one of those things that there's never always going to be a definite top, where nature will end up balancing itself back out, where if an apex predator starts taking over too much, there's going to be something else that comes out and counterbalances that. So if we've existed on the, quote, top of the food chain for so long, I mean, you got to expect that there is something out there that's, the possibility to take us out, Like, that just seems like that would just be the natural order of things.
It does, yeah. Man, I love your thought process on stuff.
Well, I appreciate that, man. Don't go anywhere, guys. We'll be right back with that deep conversation you crave. But just a quick reminder, if you'd like to snag some gear for this show, Bizarre Encounters, or one of your favorite cryptids or topics, hop on over to the Open Minds Media merch store for a wide range of designs with new drops regularly. And t-shirts now for the low price of just $15.68 plus shipping. And now let's get back into it.
Okay, so I have another story, Pale Crawler from 2012, and I don't know this one as well, like off the top of my head, so I'm going to read a little bit of it, okay? In the spring of 2012, James was a senior in high school, and he worked evenings at a grocery store. He still lived with his parents, and his drive home was usually uneventful. But one night, just after 9:30 p.m., the quiet, dark road took a strange turn. As he rounded a sharp curve where the road dropped into a gully on either side and guardrails lined the edges, his headlights caught something unusual crouched by the rail on the right. To me, this is reading a lot like Dover Demon so far,
Or almost like Frogman type stuff,
Yeah, almost like Frogman too. Yeah. Good point. And what he saw was an unexplainable creature. It was gray and gaunt, and its back was turned toward him. It had shiny, hairless skin that almost seemed to glisten. And when the lights hit it, the figure moved, turning its head almost angrily to glare at him. He saw his eyes then, and they glowed yellow in the beams. Before James could fully comprehend the situation, the creature jumped up and ran toward the gully. Its hands gripped the guardrail as it leapt over, vanishing below. And then James, he kept driving, not knowing what else to do, but he was scared while he drove. But he said he had this realization, and he said, quote, "It didn't resemble any animal I had seen before. It had no clothing, and it was almost white. The way it crouched, balanced on 2 feet, was unnervingly human-like. The image was burned into my memory. Nothing about its pale, faintly shimmering skin suggested it belonged in the Maine woods." And again, to me, it reads a lot like Dover Demon, but like you said, it also kind of reads like Frogman. So that was his brief encounter. Young kid, he's still in high school, but he's, has a job at night at the grocery store. 2012, so this is a little over a decade ago. And he sees something pretty strange. And he sees it while he's driving, and has enough wherewithal to try to capture as much of its image in his memory as possible. And it's so strange that it seems to be pretty easy for him, because all these years later, he's an adult now, all these years later, he can still recall it pretty well. And I just really like that story, And then in the book with James' story, I then tie it into the Dover Demon case. So then it goes into explaining what that's all about.
Say, if you wanted to, I know we didn't dive into it on this show. We dived into it on Bizarre Encounters, but if you want to kind of throw in some of your ideas and theories on the Dover Demon.
Yeah, well, for a long time, really, I think since discovering the Dover Demon case, which I don't even know how long that's been now, but that originally happened in 1977, is that right?
Yeah, late 70s.
Yeah. And it originally occurred in the late 70s in Dover, Massachusetts.
1977, you are correct.
Okay. And this kid was driving with a couple of his buddies, and I believe it was a school night, and they were all around 16, 17 years old. And just like in James's story, they kind of saw the creature the same way. This one was much tinier. It was about 3 feet tall, 4 feet tall or so, but it was gray, humanoid, bulbous head, spindly arms and legs, but a distended stomach. And, it wasn't menacing at all. It was kind of skittish and kind of took off running when the car came around the bend and its light shined on it. And ever since I kind of read that description and reading works by Loren Coleman about his investigation into the Dover Demon, it always read and sounded like and looked like, because these kids drew what they saw, it always looked like an alien to me, an actual extraterrestrial. And I was always curious why, more research didn't go into, UFO sightings in the area at the time. And could there be some sort of explanation for this creature? Did you have thoughts on that too? Like thinking it was an alien at any point?
Yeah, I definitely always thought that it had like the image of the gray, but I always kind of went back and forth between it definitely seems like something that could be a cave dweller, but on the flip side, it almost kind of seems like a runt alien or something like that too. I've kind of entertained both theories and ideas, just because same. There's also the cave lineups with where they supposedly saw this thing and the multiple groups that had seen it. So that's, even if it did potentially come from the cave, there's always many theories about underground alien bases too. So I guess they could both kind of fall into the same thing regardless. Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to what we were saying before about pale crawlers and indigenous tribes, and us seeing it now. We might be describing the same thing and just attributing different words to it, So I kind of always thought like, wow, this looks like a gray alien in my opinion. And so I just have continued to do lots and lots of research into the case every once in a while. It's not like I'm poring over it every night or anything, but every once in a while I'll be like, that friggin' Dover Demon, let's see what else I can dig up, And finally, one year, I dug up this one book by this one author. His name's Christopher Forrest, and I believe the book is called Curious Creatures. And it's got a really cool cover. It's kind of like a snow footprint of a big footprint, and it's got a boot next to it to show the size. So it's a really cool cover and a cool font. And I had picked up the book because I just thought it looked cool, and I hadn't read it. And, I don't know if you have listeners or if you're the same way, but I have all these books and I don't always get to them very quickly. There you go. And so I always have stacks that I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, this is my I want to get to at some point soon stack, and this is my main nice. Stack. Yeah, so I got the two going too.
There you go. So I finally crack open this book, and this is a handful of years ago now, but I crack open this book, and it's got a little chapter on the Dover Demon, and I'm like, okay, I've read everything on the Dover Demon, so I'm kind of skimming, and there's the Bartlett encounter and Abby and blah blah blah, and then it says, then he goes on to talk about a UFO encounter that happened on the same night. And it was this family that was traveling through the Natick area, which is like kind of right next door to Dover. And while they were traveling, there was this UFO that was like above their car. I mean, it was kind of high up. It was like, a little bit higher than the buildings, but it almost like followed their car or was following the road. And they happened to see it on the night that the Dover Demon was spotted. The following night, they were out driving again. I think they were coming home from like a grandmother's meal or something. And one of them claimed to have seen like this little strange looking creature. And he didn't really think anything of it at the time. He kind of thought it was just a strange animal, and he didn't see it clearly enough. And so it's like, oh, it's probably something, but I just didn't see it correctly. But then the Dover Demon case broke wide open. And of course, him being down in that area heard about it. So him and his family were talking about it, and they're like, hey, we saw a UFO the night that they were actually seen. Then the following night, I saw this weird creature, and I thought it was, some animal I just wasn't seeing clearly enough, but maybe it was the Dover Demon. So that like completely took me by surprise. It was finally a UFO connection to the Dover Demon case. And I thought that was wild. And so I also wrote about that in my book. And I did contact that author, Christopher Forrest, and I must have had outdated contact information because he never got back to me. But I was trying to find a source of where he got this information. There was nothing in his bibliography that cited where he got this information. And I was trying to at least find the source, but maybe even get the family's name. Maybe I could follow up. But unfortunately, he never messaged me. Now, going even further, I was saying earlier, Loren Coleman investigated the case famously, like he coined the term Dover Demon. And he said that there was even a Men in Black angle to it. So while he was investigating the case, he was living down in the area at the time in Massachusetts, and he was working in the area. And apparently a couple of unidentified men who weren't necessarily dressed typically as Men in Black, but they behaved as Men in Black, but they were kind of wearing all white, and they had white motorcycle helmets that they held. And they walked in and to where Coleman works, and they were asking about him. And
it's too obvious if we show up as the Men in Black. We have to show up as the Men in White this time.
Yeah, the Men in White. Because by 77, everybody knew who the Men in Black was. You know what I mean? So
we got to mix it up. This guy's aware of us. Particularly he is. So we got to show up as the Men in White this time. Throw him off at least a little bit. Motorcycle helmets, throw the fedoras. We got motorcycle helmets this time.
So they show up, and they say that they're from National Geographic. So they're changing it up again. They're not from, the government. They're not from some made up UFO organization. They said National Geographic. And according to the person that they were speaking to, they told Coleman that they seemed kind of strange. And they weren't sure if they believed that they were from National Geographic. But they were asking about Coleman. They're asking about the Dover Demon. And the person that they talked to didn't give up a lot of information other than, yeah, he works here. I don't know anything about it, And they never tried to contact Coleman again. But apparently, Coleman had shared this information with some colleagues. And another colleague in a different state, I think it was more west, maybe Arizona, but don't quote me on that. But they too had a similar encounter with a couple of men in white with white motorcycle helmets asking strange questions about a strange case, So I thought that was interesting, an interesting aspect you don't read about too much with the Dover Demon case.
Just to throw in a couple of weird ideas that I was thinking about throughout this. Well,
Please.
First and foremost, I mean, the whole idea about this thing possibly being extraterrestrial, I mean, could it be possible that this thing got marooned, whatever it was? Like maybe it did something, or it almost kind of seems like that would be a good punishment if somebody did some type of crime on an extraterrestrial planet, just to straight up like maroon somebody on Earth. Because either one, the humans are going to get you and dissect you, or you're going to get eaten by some animal. So inevitably, you're going to get taken care of by some means, and they're not going to have to get their hands dirty on it. So
like almost opposite Predator, where they're sending our aliens to us, as opposed to in the Predator universe, humans are being sent to Predator planets.
They're like, this one's weak. We can just kick him off. He'll be fine. He'll figure it out. And then this whole Men in Black phenomenon, it's been weird that this has been popping up in weirdly a lot of conversations lately. This whole idea about these things hiding themselves under a different facade. Like, I've always just heard of the Men in Black as a whole, and I've been doing this research for years, but all of a sudden this is like a reoccurring thing that's popping up, because recently I've heard this idea of like, the classic Men in Black, of course, that are driving the black Cadillacs with the suits. And then particularly in England, you'll see Men in Black, but they'll drive like Jaguars and they'll drive like British cars. Like it almost kind of fits the idea of what's going on over there. Right. And then I talked to somebody else recently, Timothy Renner actually, and he was talking about people with Sasquatch experiences, that they'll have these weird interactions with this butch lumberjack guy that's wearing plaid, and then this other guy wearing a suit, and they'll like overly question people after having weird Sasquatch encounters. And then you just brought up this whole like white suit, white helmet thing. Like I've been tracking this phenomenon forever, but all of a sudden I'm like, all these different variations of it are popping up. Like, it's weird that there could be a lot more of these experiences than people think that there are, but they hide themselves under different facades depending on what the phenomenon is. Because of course, like it would make more sense, and you'd probably be more comfortable answering questions about, I just saw some big ape man to a lumberjack looking guy. And of course, extraterrestrial stuff, the best way to get information on that is to show up like a government guy. Like it almost kind of makes sense that they kind of will play this character depending on the phenomenon getting questioned. And I'm kind of curious if they're, I don't know, maybe just bringing it up, if anybody's ever dealt with something really on fringe with like the paranormal aspect of things, and maybe they get kind of questioned by a different, archetype of people, when it comes to paranormal stuff. Like, I feel like there's a trail to follow here, and it's like a bunch of little pieces of it keep popping up,
And maybe even varying degrees of belief, because there seems to be like two types of extraterrestrial Men in Black. There's like the G-man government guy, with the fedora and the suit and the sometimes sunglasses, but very serious looking. But then there's also still in the same black suit and still in a hat, but they're very alien looking, or they're just off a little bit. They
got the olive skin. I've heard that a few times.
Yeah, and there's a famous one from Maine that happened in 1976, and he seemed very mechanical and almost robot-esque, and even physically, verbally said to the witness, like, I'm running down, I have to go now. It was very strange, and he was completely devoid of hair, So it's interesting that because that witness in particular was in a very high strangeness situation and had been having hypnotic regression sessions with a supposed abductee. And, this Man in Black visited that doctor that was doing those regression sessions. And, so maybe a G-man government type Man in Black wasn't going to suit that purpose. It needed to be more extraterrestrial or whatever in nature. Interesting,
I mean, it could even be these things like investigating themselves too, just to kind of figure out what people saw, where maybe it changes depending on also what you're experiencing, because it's them checking up on themselves just to figure out what the
species, depending on the species, maybe they don't want interactions or that level of interaction, or maybe they shouldn't be abducting or something. And they could be alien popo. We don't know.
Exactly. Basically just trying to follow the case. And that's where you have like the variations where some will seem like more robotic than others because, within like the phenomenon, of course, there is variations of these different species, different types of beings and everything. So maybe the ones that are a little bit more mechanical, like for all we know, the whole idea about things being projected in movies so that people will kind of associating it with fantasy. Men in Black itself, the movie, how many times in those movies do they show these like little alien creatures that are using these like bionic like human suits that like will flip open and they're inside the head? Like, there's so much weird stuff that's like layered in that movie that I feel like a lot of it is purposeful. Like even the weird comment about like National Enquirer about like, oh yeah, you want to get the real information. This is where you get it from. And then you think about that as some goofy magazine that's funny. But then you look into it and it's like, we think about it as being goofy, but when that magazine first came out, they would not publish anything unless somebody was like, here's a piece of this thing that I saw. Here is some footprints from a piece that I saw. Like they were very on point with the weird stuff that they were talking about when they first came out. So, the whole idea about look the other way, distracted. I mean, for all we know, the Men in Black, that could literally be their way of communicating stuff with each other, weird phenomenon. Let's write about it in the Enquirer, and then that's how we pass the message to everybody. Like,
absolutely. I love it.
Inquiries About Reality will return after this quick commercial break. And now back to the show. Diving back into some of these Maine stories, I know that you end up diving into some of the like really weird, obscure stuff, and I guess I kind of want to keep that pace going. So I'm sure within this book, you've probably dived into some weird, really obscure cases. So I'd love to kind of touch base on some of those, and just to throw it in there, just because I always love diving into some Dogman stuff. You gotta throw in maybe a Dogman story from Maine too.
Yeah. So, kind of going back to what we're talking about with like benevolent and malevolent types of creatures that people are running into, and maybe it's just our interpretation of them. We're scared, so they're bad. With Dogman, I feel like they might be bad. Like, I don't know if I've ever read like a positive Dogman encounter. I mean, I probably have, but a lot of the stuff I've read is not good. And some witnesses I've talked to, they're like, no, that was the scariest thing in my life. And they were menacing and they were weird, and I was scared, and they bluff charged. They did this, they did that.
Most Michigan encounters end with somebody putting a bullet in them, especially near the Manistee. There are endless stories about truckers putting bullets in these things.
Jeez. So there's one case from the mid 90s, and it's from this tiny little town that's about 20 miles away from me. It's called Bucksport. And Bucksport is famous for a lot of things. First of all, it's right across the river from our Fort Knox. No actual battles were ever fought there, but it was built to fortify that area of the state during, the early war times that were going on. And it's also famous because it is the I believe it's called Collinsport in Dark Shadows, the TV show, and Bucksport was the inspiration for the town that's in Dark Shadows, which is pretty
I love that movie. That's one of those obscure, forgotten favorites. That's one of those ones every couple months I'll watch just because it's like,
nice.
It's a good movie.
Yeah. And based on a TV show that I think started in the mid or late 60s and ran for a bunch of years, and which is vampiric in nature, which is always fun. And there was also this famous murder that happened there in 1898, and that actually made headlines around the world. And that story's also in my book. But in 1996, these two nuns were on a sabbatical, and they came to Maine, and they came to Bucksport. And they were staying at that version of an Airbnb. Realistically, I think the church found them a house to stay in, in the area. So they weren't at like a local hotel. They were at a home. And they were walking home one evening or back to the house. And it was really foggy that night. And Bucksport gets really foggy, especially in the summertime, because the river's right there. And there's always a cold and warm front happening right in that area, especially around such a large river. And so it was foggy that night. They're walking home and they start to like feel a rumble. They weren't actually hearing it yet, but they were like feeling this rumble. And it was dark, but the streetlights were kind of like, however far apart streetlights are based. And so that was helping them with the lighting, but everything else was very dark. And the growl or the rumbling was disturbing. And at one point, one of them thought that it was, maybe I'm starting to hear it. And is it a growl? Like, what is this thing? What are we hearing? So they keep walking, and down in the fog near one of the other streetlights, they see this like hulking kind of figure in the, and it's silhouetted within the fog and the light, the street light. And it seems to be getting closer to them, but it also seems to be like avoiding light. So these two nuns, they're not talking about anything demonic. They think it might be an actual creature. Is it a bear? Is it, what the hell is it? And they're like, let's stay as much as we can in the light of the street light. So they're doing this, and they're trying to get closer because they're pretty close to where they're staying. So if they can just get inside, they'll feel a lot better. But this thing gets so close to them that it started to bluff charge them. And at one point, it got into the light. And they saw this hulking figure. They assumed about 8 feet tall, big barrel chest, and it had the face of a wolf. And they saw the pointed ears. They saw the short brown fur. It was, had no clothing or anything. And it was growling, verbally growling where they could hear it. And they were terrified. So at this point, they're stuck under a streetlight. And this beast is kind of lurking around the light's edges. So it's a little bit a ways from them because that street light kind of shines, a little bit far out around them. It's not like they're under this small spotlight. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So they, at a couple of points, they almost like try to make a run for it from the streetlight to the house because they can see the house at this point. And they're like, it's so close. But this thing wouldn't leave. Just when they thought it was gone, they almost took off. And they almost took off to the point where one of them like stumbled and fell because they like took off, but then had to stop on a dime because the creature was right there. And so the other one helped her up, and a knee got hurt. It was a whole thing. They were so scared that they stayed under the streetlight until morning. Apparently, sometime in the middle of the night, they think the creature wandered off finally, but they refused to leave. And they also thought it was strange that nobody's around. Like somebody helps, somebody walk by,
It's almost like one of those warps or something. Like you're almost like in this time that's like away from time,
Yeah. Because it was so strange that nobody wasn't walking by because it's not like they were in a remote area of town. There really isn't a remote area of town unless they're way off, but they weren't. They were close to downtown. They had walked from downtown to where they were going to their house, which is along the river. So morning comes, in sunlight is there, and they finally feel safe. So they finally go home. And that's where their report ends. There was no follow-up with these ladies. There was also no names or anything, so I couldn't personally follow up. But boy, it reads really, really creepy. And it's interesting that it was these two nuns and this beast, this creature was just menacing them for half the night. But I thought that's one of the creepier stories I've heard,
See, that kind of brings in like the two different sides to the whole like dogman aspect that it's almost like the Sasquatch stuff that some people think that they're very physical and then the other half think that there's something very spiritual. But there's definitely this like weird connection with dogmen and something that's on the, I don't want to use the word necessarily demonic, but something like on the demonic side where there seems to be this like...
There's an evilness or something.
There's like a biblical connotation to these things. And I don't know if this also kind of plays into like going into like the Black Shuck story where you had this, black giant, it was on four feet instead of standing up on two, but essentially this thing came into a church, ended up killing a couple people, took off, went into another church, killed another couple people, and then on its way out slashed the door, and you can still find those marks today, and they call them like the devil's fingerprints or devil's claw marks or something like that.
Yeah, I think claw marks.
And they're like burned into like the side of the door, but like there seems to be there's always this overlying aspect of like the biblical side of things and these like dark dog figures representing like evil or pure evil or something. So it's like, are these things like a physical creature that people are experiencing, or are they rather like a manifestation of evil, and we just kind of put this characteristic on it of these like dog-like beings because we already kind of have that in our minds with like the hellhounds and like all this other like trickling of stuff that's associated with dogs and the demonic, or even Cerberus, you know, like being one of the guardians of hell. I mean,
right. And, you know, that's the lens I assume that two nuns would be looking at this through. You know what I mean? Like, and so this physical thing is happening to them, seemingly physical thing. Like they didn't describe it in a spiritual way at all. So it seems like this physical thing is happening to them, but they're seeing it through their lens, which would lean more towards biblical than if I had the experience. You know what I mean? So is that playing into it at all in how they're describing it? You know, that's, you know, I guess I don't really know what that says other than to fortify the theory that you're talking about right now, you know, with the black dogs and, you know, the guards of the gates of hell and all those things. You know, was it described that way because who was seeing it? You know, I don't know.
I mean, or even on the other side, I mean, it kind of could play into the whole aspect of like the fallen angels, the Nephilim, like this altered DNA. But even on the flip side, I mean, there's two viewpoints on that, you know, you could be looking at it from a biblical context, or you could be looking at it from an extraterrestrial context, that there was something that came here and started just mixing genetics. But I mean, it seems to me like that would be the most viable option as to what these things are. And I mean, again, whether you're looking at it from the biblical aspect or the more ancient aliens aspect, I mean, I think we're still just putting different names on this. We're on talking about the same thing.
We're still describing the same stuff. and it's the different lenses, man. It's so crazy. And, you know, I try, at least I think I try to be as unbiased as possible, but I do have my own lenses and I don't mean to put them on because I don't want to. I want to try to see things from a whole, a bigger, zoomed out perspective to see if we can make more threads. You know what I mean? In all of this stuff. Because again, I think within the paranormal community, the Bigfoot community, the other cryptids, you know, the French cryptids community and aliens, like, I think there's some common threads, and within us, we're using different words to describe a lot of the same things, you know? So from a researcher standpoint, I do try to zoom out as much as I can, but I don't want to zoom out so far that, you know, I'm losing perspective, you know what I mean? So it's a delicate balance, and my biases are going to come into play sometimes, and other people reading my biases is going to come into play with their own biases. And then all of that kind of gets cross-contaminated here and there, and it becomes whatever it is. And, you know, that's fine. We're all doing our best, but it's really interesting to think about and try to follow the logic on the different perspectives. And like you were saying with the Wendigo and skinwalkers and pale crawlers and indigenous tribes and what we're seeing. And it's probably the same stuff. We're just calling it something different.
I mean, even within the tribes, I mean, I had somebody on recently who was from the Navajo Nation, and he's talking about like skinwalkers, and everybody's like, oh, that's a skinwalker. I'm seeing a skinwalker here. I'm seeing it here. And he said, no, skinwalkers, that name is specifically meant for like the Navajo. But he said, that being said, every single Native American group, they have a different name for these skinwalker type things. They have a different name for these little people. They have a different name for these Sasquatch beings. So even within like Native folklore, you already see that if you talk to any of them, they basically say that these creatures are what everybody sees, and then just every group has different names for them. So I mean, why can't we view that on a broader lens that, you know, there's probably only so many things that we're dealing with and interacting with, but we think that there's hundreds of them because we've categorized them as different things. Even just fitting them into your viewpoint of what you are familiar with in that area. Cause it's like, you know, you go to Africa and they have these experiences with hyena men because it's the most relatable thing to a dog man. But some people categorize that as a different thing when realistically we're all talking about the same thing. Like you see these continuing phenomenon go all the way around the world. Like you see fairy stuff popping up everywhere. It's just over here they call it something different. You see dogman ideas everywhere. You see Sasquatch stuff everywhere. Like it's all the same types of creatures. It's just they fit into like different regions with different names, and we categorize them differently.
Like case in point, I have a Pukwudgies chapter in my book, and one of them very much reads like a Pukwudgie, meaning like the indigenous definition of what Pukwudgies are. But there's another story that it might even be just the next story after it, where it's a non-native person, a white person, and they're in the same state where this other one was seen. And the way they described it was a little bit more gnome-like. And I feel like that was just from their perspective, but everything else, even in its description, reads more Pukwudgie. So I think it's another instance of they're seeing the same thing, but describing, attributing a different name to it,
Yeah, I was going to say, like, the stuff in the Fae, like the Manahuni, the gnomes, like, it's all described as, like, the same stuff. And even, like fairies, for example. I mean, that sounds like something that you instantly associate with Europe, but most of like the old encounters with these fairies, I mean, there are some that kind of describe them a little bit more in detail with like what they physically look like, but most of the descriptions are these like balls of light that show up in the middle of the woods. And it's like you translate them to the US and we're calling them orbs, but realistically we're describing the same thing that people have been describing for thousands of years with fairy lore over in Europe. And we also have the same thing with missing time, where people will disappear, they'll never come back. And it's like, over in Europe they were calling it like the stories of the changelings. Over here we're calling it missing 411. Like it's all the same phenomenon, it just has different names, so people are now categorizing this stuff differently, not realizing that the phenomenon doesn't seem to be central located in one place. It's something that's happening everywhere. It's just, again, under a million different names, but it's all the same phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hold that thought. We'll be back in a flash. But if you don't like hearing the ads, then I have a solution for you. You can get ad-free and early access to this show and Bizarre Encounters with Shayn and Orin on the Open Minds Media Patreon for just $1 a month. That's less than the price of a bag of chips, and it's a great way to support the show and all the hard work behind it. And if you're interested in merch store discounts or premium video versions of the show, then there are a few other tiers with additional benefits and 7-day free trials available. Now let's get back into it.
And you brought up fairies and the lights, and I do want to tell a brief fairy story that's very recent. A lot of the fairy stuff I was looking into in Maine, because I was trying not to only share like stories from the 1800s. I just froth at the mouth for modern stories, and when I can find them and share them, I want to. And I found a fairy story from 2019.
Oh wow!
And it happened right on the banks of a river in a major town in Maine. The town is called Bangor. And these two people were camping, and it was the middle of the night, and this guy's girlfriend had already fallen asleep. He was, they were sleeping in a tent, and he was kind of up, scrolling on his phone and stuff. And through the tent, he can see these two white orbs of light. So as the story's unfolding for me, when I'm first reading it, it sounds very extraterrestrial, what he's describing. So he sees these two orbs of light, and they're kind of doing like this aerial display above his tent in the sky. And they're doing like figure eights and kind of like playfully, playing with each other, if you will. Nothing malevolent at all. And then more orbs come, and they're different colors. There's blue and reds and greens, and they all come, and the white ones stay higher, but the colored ones get lower and lower. And then they just absorb themselves and pass through the tent wall. And now they're inside the tent with the guy. And he said they're very small orbs of light. And he's just watching them, and he's like shaking his girlfriend, like, wake up, you got to see this. And she's not waking up. And these orbs of light, one of them comes towards him. The other two or three stay back, and the white ones are still outside, kind of doing their aerial display still. And this red one, it shapeshifts right in front of him. And he says it looks like a small dragonfly, this thing with wings. But instead of an insect, it had 2 arms and 2 legs and a face. And it's inches from his face, and he's looking at this strange entity that's right in front of him, and he's waking up his girlfriend. He's like, it's shape-shifted now. And she's actually been awake the whole time, and she's like, no, I don't want to see it. I don't want to see it. And
I'm not moving. If I didn't see it, it didn't happen.
And so she's keeping her head buried, and he's like, oh, you got to see this. So almost like on cue, like as if understanding how scared she was, this thing shapeshifted back into its red orb, joined the others, and then they all left the tent the same way. They just passed through the tent wall. They went up and joined the two white ones, and then they all just kind of floated away. And that was the experience. And it was terrifying for the girl, and it was very unsettling for the guy. But him reflecting back on it, he was like, boy, that was, like he was gleeful. He was, excited. He was, I can't believe that's something I experienced. And he's like, I think there were fairies. He even thought they might have been extraterrestrials at the time, but, they didn't, to him, just because there were orbs of light, that's the only thing that seemed extraterrestrial. Everything else was very organic and like from the earth, and it didn't get anything malevolent from them. They seemed very peaceful and of the area, really interesting.
See, that's where they trick you, though. They got to try to lure you in a little bit, They got to seem like they're playing, nasty, they're doing this thing. Yeah, because all the stories of these things are mean as hell. But all of it that they usually trap people in is with this, oh, come follow me, everything's okay. That's why there's all these stories about kids where they'll be like, oh, come play with me.
Yeah.
And then they disappear. And same with the men. It's usually stories where they end up going after men in particular because they knew they can lure them off. But I wonder if in that case it was maybe they had an interest in him and they were like, all right, maybe we can lure this guy off while his girlfriend's sleeping. Yeah. And then once they realize, all right, she's horrified and he ain't budging, they just kind of were like, all right, this ain't worth our time.
Exactly,
let's go on to the next one,
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Now, I found another story from the same river, but it happened in 1833. And it was 4 indigenous men that went out hunting, and they were in their canoes, and they came across this area where they saw this smoke rising up, and it was from a ridge that was higher up, and they were like, what the hell is that? And so they kind of set up camp and everything for the night, and they were hearing all of these crazy sounds. They described it as like ghosts and witches making sounds like in the forests around them. And they were really scared, and they had a hard time sleeping that night, but everybody survived the night. They woke up fine. But in the light of day, they wanted to check out the area a little bit more to see if there was anything to what was going on. So they look up at this ridge again. There's still smoke coming from something. So they're like, something's got to be up there. Let's go check it out. So 2 of the guys go ahead to check it out, and 2 of them stay behind to, stay at camp. So these 2 guys get up there, and they see that there's this really large, wigwam type structure. And they go inside of it, and there's this huge kettle. And what they realize is that it's not smoke, it's steam, and it's boiling water. And on the walls of the wigwam, leaning against it, were these huge utensils, these person-sized forks and spoons and knives, and they were made out of whalebone or something. And they were like, what the hell's going on? And there was this ladder that was kind of near the pot. So he climbs up, one of them climbs up it to look in the pot, and he's seen limbs. He's seen legs and arms, and
I would not have checked in that pot. Seems like you're just gonna get pushed in.
Yeah, right. And so he sees this little girl's dress, and he's like, "What? We got to get out of here, dude!"
It's a trap.
Yeah. So they get out of there. They go back and they tell the other 2 guys, what they saw, and they're like, "Yeah, let's get the hell out of here. We don't know what that is. We gotta go." So they go to this different area to fish and hunt. And when they get to this area, they see all these strange little creatures. And to them, they're describing them as fairies. But to me, it reads a lot more like these amphibious, aquatic, gnome-like creatures.
The water babies? Is that what you're...
Yeah, maybe a little bit, but they're clothed, which is interesting. And so they really want to try to capture them. They haven't been seen yet. So they developed this silly plan where they bury one of them in the sand. And when, some walk close by and hopefully they don't see the guy who's buried, he can kind of jump out quick and grab them. And exactly that happens. He ends up capturing one of them, and he's just 18 inches tall or something like that. And he's screaming and kicking, and they're like, "What the hell are you?" And he's like, "Listen, you want to know everything about us? Come back here in a week and I'll introduce you to our king. I'll introduce you to the rest of the town and all of that good stuff." And these guys didn't really trust it, but they're like, "Okay, we'll go in peace," because they were outnumbered and they didn't know what they had for weapons, these little creatures. So they were like, okay, we'll back off. They came back in a week, and sure enough, the little creature was there, and they led him down to this area that was near the water. And when they got to the water, they said that they saw this giant creature there, and that was their king. And he was kind of like laying Lionel Richie style, or like Michael Jackson style, like laying down with the head propped up with the hand and the legs extended out.
What's the Greek god, the one for like parties and wine? He's always sitting on the chair like that.
Yeah.
Talk about an archetype, right?
Right? Just like that, dude. And it kind of paid the humans no mind. Like, it was almost like the king was told, like, "Hey, we're going to have these weird humans come down just so they can like see you. And we're going to tell them a little bit about our history and stuff and blah, blah, blah." So these guys, these humans see this giant, like we're talking, like 13, 14, 15 feet tall, like huge.
This explains the kettle and the utensils.
Yes. And he said that what they witnessed was actually a thing that only happens like once a year. But the little creatures' jobs are like to scare children to fall into the water. And then the giants will grab them after they've died, and they save them up, and then they eat them with all the other giants of all the other nations that are in the area, and they'll have a big potluck and they'll eat the kids like, once or twice a year. And that's what they happened upon. Just a wild friggin' story, right? From, the early 1800s, in this indigenous tribe. And it does read a lot like lore, but it's also fascinating. And it happened on the same lake where all these years later, over, almost 200 years later, where this guy's chilling in a tent with his girlfriend, and these little fairies come in. I just thought it was incredibly fascinating. And I had to include both stories in the Humanoid Encounters book because it was just terribly fascinating. And one reads more real while the other reads more lore. But when you take it in all together, the same area, the history of the area, maybe what happened in the 1800s isn't that far off from reality, I
mean, even looking at how the aspect of this phenomena would work. I mean, you got these giants and you got these little people, but they know that they're outnumbered realistically by the humans. So wouldn't it make more sense for them to inevitably team up and kind of create this like ecosystem amongst themselves? Because at the end of the day, it's like
the balance you were talking about.
Yeah, the giant can squish all the little ones, or the little ones can go and get this thing's food and then ends up becoming their king. It's like this back and forth thing of like, you protect me, I'll protect you kind of a thing. Like it's symbiotic,
Yeah.
And I mean, that's usually part of with like a lot of the folklore and stuff, is because usually when you start diving into like the European stuff with like the like the other Fae lore, and you start diving into like the trolls and everything, it's like usually all the trolls will be accompanied by like fairies and all these like smaller creatures alongside with them too.
Right.
Like it would make sense that again, these things would like cohabitate with each other and find like a way to be able to basically stay alive together.
Yeah. I mean, that's happening now in our woods and forests with species that we know of,
Yeah, I mean, look at wolves in ravens, I think it is, right?
Yeah.
Where they'll go and they'll tell them like basically where the bodies are, where there's something hiding that they can go and hunt, and they'll go hunt it down, and then the trade-off is that the raven gets to have a snack when the wolves are done. Like,
yeah. Lots of symbiotic relationships going on in nature. So why that wouldn't happen with unknown creatures? I mean, it certainly would, I would think.
And I mean, it also, again, even kind of getting into like the missing 411 stuff, like it basically just translates, like I said earlier, with like the changeling aspect of things, that it's like, why would they want to lure these kids in? And even if they weren't necessarily eating them, but they have these stories about keeping them in like this Fey world, like what would be the reasoning behind that? The reasoning would be that they want to basically fill the place with a fairy over on the human side. And then maybe by having this kid, there seems to be this, I don't know, like an energy source or like something that all these things use that seems to come from like humans. So whether it's like the soul or consciousness or something, like it seems like it's beneficial to keep humans around for whatever reason, but in turn, like, do this like exchange thing where you like take their place, or again, they never come back after going into this like weird time slip.
Yeah. There's this interesting, in my research of fairies just in general, I found some interesting information that was really hard to like pinpoint actual origin. And I wanted to read a little bit of that. So scholars note that fairies are seen from the Sanskrit Gandharva to the nymphs of Greek mythology and Homer, and the genies of Arabic mythology. Yet there is no definitive source that ties the beings to a single origin. Some theories suggest that they were pagan deities forced to suppress their traditions by Christian missionaries. As the religion grew, fairies were changed from deity status to magical creature status in order to preserve their traditions, which is kind of interesting, a little bit of what we touched on earlier. And despite these varying histories, tales of fairies persist, and people claim to encounter them even today. So an interesting aspect that it's tough to trace these origins because they happen in so many different eras and in different religions and in different areas throughout history and as far back as recorded time. So it's really hard to pin down one origin. So it goes back to what we're talking about, where all of these things were kind of happening all over and they were being called different things, or there just wasn't that communication between these areas because there's, massive distances which weren't being covered, during that time. So a trade of information couldn't happen,
I mean, going back to how potentially old these things could be, I mean, if you take into consideration that, things may have potentially kind of fit the niche in different ways. So you, of course, have this giant lore. You have obviously us, like, average size, middle sized people. And then you also have these really small beings. So if you're kind of like looking at the niche of, I guess, the environment, like anything that's really big, inevitably it ends up dying out because there doesn't end up being a big enough food source to sustain these things. But on the flip side of it, things that are small, they tend to be able to live way longer because they'll find these like little nooks and crannies, like these little perfect spots where they don't need nearly as much food. They don't need nearly as much water. So it would make sense that the one that would be the one that seems to be more dominant would be the little people, because they would be able to fit that niche to be able to stay alive because they wouldn't need a lot of resources. Yeah. And now it seems like we're getting into this point again where, we're starting to stretch out again as people. Like, we're starting to cut into these different areas of woods to keep expanding like our bigger cities and all of that. So if these things have been kind of cohabitating in their own area for a while, and now we're getting to a point again where we're starting to basically infringe on their territory, then it would make sense these sightings are starting to spark back up again, because, for a long time, like, fairy lore was just looked at as simply folklore, but the past like 5-10 years, it seems like this stuff is really starting to pop back up. But on the other side, just to throw this in there, like, Europe never stopped believing in these things, to the point where how many European countries are there that'll say, all right, this is a fairy part of the woods, and they will literally spend thousands, millions, maybe extra dollars to veer the road completely away from that area and come back. So it's like, if there wasn't an honest sense of belief and it wasn't just some folklore, like, why would you take that much extra money and time to completely pull away from that area to come back to what you're doing instead of just going straight through it?
Right. And that goes for, not only fairies, but trolls, leprechauns, gnomes, even banshees, like
even Sasquatch stories. How many stories are there of Sasquatch tearing up roads as they're trying to build them through the woods?
Yeah. It's I love how belief is so intrinsic to their sense of being, in Europe. It's really fascinating. And I kind of wish we were a little bit more like that here.
I mean, even in like Scandinavian countries, I know that there's a lot of people that'll still build the fairy houses, and you always find some like really weird pictures on the internet where, I mean, obviously at this point it's really, really hard to believe stuff on the internet, but when you get into some of these old pictures where it's a little bit harder to doctor, like there's some that are, really weirdly believable of like, little lights on inside these houses, or like see like little heads peeking out of the windows in these houses and stuff. And again, it's like folklore is folklore, but if you go and talk to these people, like they don't talk about it like it's, it's just part of our heritage. Like, no, they're there. Like we We build them a house, we leave them alone. You know, if we build a new house on new property, part of the rule is that we have to build them a house in the back, and then we never touch that house. We just put stuff out front.
Yeah. And that's in some indigenous lore or history where, you know, these little creatures, when a church was being built by a native tribe, I think it was Wabanaki, but don't quote me on that. But a church was being built by this indigenous nation, and right alongside it was a miniature church being built, and they kind of built it in the same schematics, you know, as not only as not as tribute, but these creatures were doing it for their own faith, and you know, so they had their own place of worship. Really fascinating. Now, another piece of that, in regards to like adapting to where one lives, you know, can these things adapt or create or go into a different dimension that's right alongside ours, you know, that we just don't get to see often for whatever reason?
Hold that thought. Inquiries of Our Reality will be right back after this brief commercial break. And now let's dive back in.
But I do have this story about this kid when he was 9 years old. He was out playing with his sister, and he was 9, his sister was 12, and they were in this little cul-de-sac area, and it had just snowed the previous morning. So the ground in the woods was all snow covered. And while he's out playing, he sees these tiny little footprints, and it doesn't look like a squirrel. It doesn't look like a bird. He sees like these tiny footprints and there's a lot of them, and they're all like leading away in towards the woods. So he starts to follow them, and he doesn't have to go too far, but he comes to the base of this tree, and he's looking around, and he's like, what's happening here? Where like the footprints just kind of like disappeared by the edge of this tree. And then all of a sudden his vision kind of goes blue. There's a blue haze over everything. And now where there wasn't anything, he's seeing like this tiny little like miniature town. And he can see that there's these little creatures walking around, and a lot of them are carrying wood, and they're making a big bonfire in the middle of this tiny town. And just then he feels like this little tap on his shoulder. And so he looks, and he says there's this little tiny mushroom creature.
Is this Kevin?
It is.
Yeah, I was just about to bring Kevin up too. Yep.
Yeah. So Kevin sees this mushroom creature, and it says, you don't need those. And it smacks his head, and his glasses go flying off. And he's like, what the hell? And then it all kind of goes away, and his sister comes around, and he's trying to tell or not tell his sister what happened, but he's like kind of in shock, and he doesn't have his glasses on, and his sister steps right on his glasses. So she breaks them. And so now they have to go and tell mom that the glasses broke. But what's interesting is he goes to the eye doctor to kind of, get his glasses again. They do a new test, and he doesn't need them anymore. Like to this day, Kevin doesn't need glasses. It's so crazy. And I love his story. And, was he given access to this other dimension that's happening right along ours? And, so was that an adaptation of those little mushroom creatures,
See, I'm kind of curious too, if it may not even necessarily be that these things go into a different dimension, so to speak, but rather that they have almost like a mirage front up, that it's like anybody could potentially walk through it. And it's not that it's walking into another reality, but it's rather that, I don't know, whatever abilities they have, they're just able to create this
like
area
cloaking or
where
something.
It's almost like cloaked, because Kevin's story, a bunch of these different fae things, it's almost like people are just walking in the woods, and then they just like walk into a place that they're just like, how did I even get here? Like maybe it's just always there, and it's always been there. And we associate these things with walking through trees, but they're not walking through trees. They're walking through this wall that, they are aware that they can walk through it. But an average person, they're just like, oh, there's some really thick bushes. I can't go that way anyway. So they just deter and walk the other way. Right. Because even diving into a lot of the old fae lore, it's like the fairy kingdoms are usually just this obscure spot that's like in the middle of nowhere in the woods, and people will talk about like going into another reality, but could it simply just be that there's a mirage up over this area, and you you can walk through it at any point. That's how people accidentally walk into these places.
Yeah, and some of that missing 411 stuff is kind of at play there as well, where people are stepping into these cloaked or hidden areas and they're not aware of what's happening, but then they step out again. And, this time passed differently, that gets to be a whole thing as well. But it's really interesting to think about. And we have a mountain here. It's called Mount Katahdin, and it's riddled with indigenous lore. And a big piece of the lore is that there's areas near the peak, which is hikeable. People hike them today. Where you can walk into the mountain, and that's where some of these indigenous creatures that they spoke of live. And there's lots of stories of people walking into the mountain, and you can find them if you start feeling around, and you'll just kind of fall into it. So the facade is the mountainside, is the actual rock, but it is passable. You can pass through it.
See, this kind of reminds me of trying to remember what they're called. There's like this Australian folklore about these beings that like live between the rocks. And it seems like almost kind of like reminiscent of that, according to the folklore, it sounds like these things are literally living between cracks, but maybe it's just a matter of perspective that they're called Quinkin. That's what it is. But it's just a matter of like, you're looking at the rock and you think it's a crack, but it's not actually a crack. It's actually like an opening, but just from that focal point. It's kind of like those Victorian age things where they'd have the secret rooms by just making striped walls on one wall, and you wouldn't even notice that there's this 5-inch indent that you can turn and go this way down a hallway in, same concept. Yeah.
And there was this Mothman-like creature that had been seen in Maine. And if you saw it from just a slightly different perspective, it was thin like paper. And then when you saw it like from another perspective, it was a full-size creature.
That seems to be how these things were described that I was talking about too. Because I had, it was a long time ago, but one of the friends that I had from Australia, and he was talking about all the lore and everything. And it again lines up with that. So there's another continuation of like this lore being viewed from a bunch of different points. But that's one of those like obscure things. You don't really hear people talking about these creatures that live between rocks because it just sounds so unplausible. But you start getting into like the whole astrophysics of things, and even combining with like fairies, you get into this whole aspect of like pocket dimensions and the possibility of pocket dimensions, and it fits and coincides with that. And then you get into this whole, like, how does this thing fit flat between this rock? And then you start getting into the whole aspect of, like, multiple dimensions. And I know I talk about this aspect all the time on the show, but, like, if you're underwater and you look up at, like, a ball coming down, it just looks like a circle. But once you leave the water, you realize it's a full sphere. We could be dealing with a bunch of these things that we talk about them being interdimensional, but there's not too many people that actually bring the idea in that we're only looking at them from our dimensional perspective. That, again, it's a matter of looking at them from that other dimension, and it completely logically makes sense when you're viewing it with science. It's just obscure stuff that doesn't make sense until the literal science starts kind of catching up with things. But this whole astrophysics thing seems to be pairing a lot with the phase aspect of things. Yeah.
And, John Keel touched on a lot of it with his ultra-terrestrial stuff, all these things coming from within, it all kind of plays together.
I mean, even talking about him too, I mean, the phenomenon as a whole, I've always kind of entertained this whole theory that, there might just be this other, so to speak, and we create all of these little niches, and it's kind of like the Tulpa concept, but rather than like us creating it with our thoughts, it's rather that we create this open slot, and then whatever this other is takes that slot. And in our reality, it seems like they're taking the shape of all these different creatures, but that may not be the case. If we're dealing with the beings that are from another dimension, who knows what their definite shape is? Because even correlating stuff with the Bible and connecting it with astrophysics. I mean, you talk about the angels, the actual depiction of the angels is like all these eyes with spinning wheels, and they're very like interdimensional sounding beings. But we look at them from the human perspective, and they're like, oh, I'm going to portray myself as this human looking thing because that's what you're the most comfortable with. Like translate that to all of this phenomenon. And I mean, again, there's another perspective of we're all possibly talking about the same thing. There could just be this other that can just take its shape within this reality because it doesn't have a definite shape, or maybe all of these shapes are part of whatever this unfathomable shape that this thing might have in a higher dimension that we wouldn't even be able to understand looking at anyways.
Yeah. Even Carl Sagan touched on that. There's a whole part of his career where he was very like anti-extraterrestrial, but there was a time when he was starting to loosen up on a bunch of that stuff. And he hypothesized that for them to make themselves known to us, that they would probably want to approach us by something that was easier to understand and easier to look at. And he even took that thought process and included it in his book Contact, where this alien race wants to contact us, and the way that it presents itself is of this woman's father, because they thought that was the easiest thing for her to comprehend and process and not be so scared, at what they actually are. And just a fascinating concept on, things. It might not even be our perspective. It might be a way for us, at least for some of these creatures, to make us comfortable with their existence, should that be something that they care about, because I'm sure not all these creatures care about what our perspective on them is. But
I'm trying to remember what the name of this creature is from Star Trek, but it was mentioned a few times in the original series. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because, again, we're talking about this whole idea about things being translated through media so that it can either be looked at as fiction or make it so it's easier for people to understand. But They regularly talk about this concept about beings basically getting to a point where they evolve past having like a physical version, where they end up becoming like an energy source. And within that energy source, they can now manifest however they choose to manifest. So I know there's a lot of conspiracies on Star Trek about like almost like The Simpsons about like where are they getting this information and everything from, or like these ideas from. But I mean, if we're looking at it as that, we think about, what could have existed on this planet before us, maybe this idea could have been something that happened with a previous race that's existed on this planet, is that they inevitably evolved past having like this physical form so that they became these like energetic type beings. And once they become these energetic beings, they can take whatever form they want to choose directly in front of you. So, I mean, there could be this like underlying idea of this like hidden throughout media, and it completely fits the idea of this that, I mean, even within Star Trek, I mean, when they encounter these things, they'll just manifest whatever they want in front of them. Like all of a sudden they'll be on a desert planet, then all of a sudden they'll just be like in front of them standing there as a person. And then they can just manifest whatever because they're not physical. So they can just take this energy and make it look like something. But going into the whole quantum physics of things, we realize that everything is just frequency and vibration. So if you could vibrate a portion of energy at a certain frequency, I mean, potentially it could at least appear as something physical.
Yeah. And to go in another completely different direction, but it still ties in, are near-death experiences where people go through the process of passing away, and they turn into these light or energy beings. And so many people have talked about kind of flowing down this river of energy, and it's a euphoric feeling. It's something like we've never experienced before, but we're not in physical form, but our thought processes are still in place. And so a lot of these stories are people coming back, and they're almost frustrated to come back to human form because they finally got to experience what it was like to be fully energy and vibration and light, and but it's interesting to have it be from a completely like NDE perspective, but it's still kind of in the realm of what we're talking about.
I mean, even to go in another direction, I mean, talking about people that have like the really intense DMT experiences, and they get to a point where they start talking about these beings that basically will just talk or make sound, and they'll start creating these like objects and like physical things like in front of them. I mean, all of these things could potentially be the same realm because it all comes into like frequency and vibration. And even with psychedelics, like when you start having that come up, you feel this like vibration and frequency that hits. But I mean, we already see these underlying ideas that like reality is more malleable than we think it is. And we get into this whole idea that the dimension above can alter the dimension below. Like we can, alter things on a piece of paper. So who's to say that the next dimension up can't alter things in our reality? And it's just a matter of speaking them into fruition, because, if they're a group that can basically everything that exists is through energy, and we realize that everything in our reality is vibration and frequency. I mean, these things can literally just create something that's physical in our reality using vibrations and frequencies from their reality. Like, it's a really deep, weird concept. But again, connecting it with astrophysics, like, it sounds very spiritual, but it starts to, we're starting to get to the point where we're starting to kind of connect some points of logic where we can make this make sense with science, how this could potentially work.
Right. There are explanations here and there. And for me, I don't feel like I'm smart enough to like, put them all together, but keep having these discussions with lots of different people. And I think we can put a lot of threads together,
Stay tuned, guys. This is our last break. But if you enjoyed the show and you think I deserve it, then please leave a review or rating for this show on iTunes, Spotify, or any other podcatcher you happen to use. Your continued support is what makes this show possible, and your opinions go a long way to help the show grow and improve. So thank you. Now feel free to skip past these ads so we can get back to the show. And we are back, so let's get back to it. I mean, that's something that's happening even within the phenomenon, and it's everybody's kind of been talking about it, that everything was kind of dissected between, like, here's the UFO guys, here's the cryptid guys, here's the paranormal guys, and now everybody's realizing that there's all these common ties between everything. So it's like, it's very rare now that you find somebody that just studies one phenomenon, because even you, I mean, you start off with UFOs and then you realize there's all these fake connections, then you realize there's all these other connections. So it's getting to a point where it's very hard to ignore the fact that all of this phenomenon is connected and more than likely coming from the same source or has some type of common ancestor along the way. Yeah. Well put. But I guess kind of starting to wrap up towards the end, and I know that I could definitely go another hour, so we'll have to set up another round because we only touched base on a couple of creatures this time. But I always like ending with some words of wisdom. So if there's any words of wisdom you might want to bestow on the listeners today, what might it be?
Words of wisdom today. Now, I think kind of to tie a bow on our discussion tonight, I think maybe the best words of wisdom is to, never act like you know 100% what's going on, because it's most likely wrong, and be open to other ideas and be open to other possibilities. And don't get lured into the woods. You hear a weird sound, just don't go. You see some pretty lights, just don't go. I suppose unless you're a researcher, because boy, I want to follow, I want to go, and it's not always the safest thing to do. So that's good advice from you. See, but in the end of it, I know that at least most researchers, nobody wants to be abducted by aliens, but at the end of the day, like, it's an experience, and I know that, as traumatic as an experience as it would be, my dumbass will probably be the first one if I see a UFO that's like, what do you got going on up there? You put yourself into the danger, I'm sure you've done it. Paranormal investigating. Everybody's scared to go and check something out. You're the first one to go, I'll climb through the hole. Let's see what's going on in there. I gotta see. I gotta know. Your curiosity gets you into trouble. As they say, curiosity killed the cat. If you're a researcher, you're going to be the first one that ends up having a weird experience because you're the first one that's going to be dumb enough to run headfirst towards it. Very true, my friend. Thinking you're smart enough to deal with it, but that's where the ignorance comes in, like you mentioned. I know rationally that I'm not. I'm still going to do it. I partially understand how your phenomenon works, so I'm going to take my chances. Maybe I'll understand it better on the other side, or I'll never be seen again. But either way, I'll feel better. Because inevitably, that's how every researcher would want to go out, is by, seeing the phenomenon. But the worst part about that would be the fact that you wouldn't be able to share it, so you'd still be crazy and live in the oblivion, I know. And if anybody wanted to come and pick up your newest book or check out any of your older books, such as the one we talked about last time, UFOs over Maine, where can people come and find your awesome books at, man? Sure. If you do a search for my name on Google, Nomar Slevik, it's such a unique name that all my stuff just inherently comes up. It's really easy. But I also have an online store, slevikstore.company.site. All my books are for sale there. And if you buy one there, then you get the personal touch where it's signed by me. You get a bookmark, maybe a sticker if I have some around, and all that cool stuff. And I personally, mail it out. But it's also available on Amazon. And there are ebook versions on Kindle and Apple. Again, just type my name in and they're all going to come up for you. My newest book is Humanoid Encounters. And it's about 100 stories of crazy things Mainers have seen in our state. And it's really no different from any other state. So if you want to read some crazy, kooky stories, this book has a whole bunch of them.
And we'll definitely have to come back for a part 2. So we'll just call this one a part 2 of diving into this new book, because I feel like we probably only covered a couple different things. You probably have another hour or two worth of conversation to at least cover in this book. So we'll have to set that one up sooner rather than later, man, because it's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, this is always fun. Thank you so much, Shane.
If you guys enjoyed today's conversation and want to show some love, smash that follow icon and share today's episode with a friend. Grassroots support from listeners just like you guys is exactly how the show grows, so thank you. And if you'd like to get in touch with me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can do so through email, which is inquiriesofourrealitypodcast@outlook.com, or through social media, Instagram and Facebook, or you guys can get a hold of me through the submission form, which of course is available off of the link tree. And the last way you guys can get a hold of me is through the hotline. You guys can text or call that, whatever is easier for you guys. And that number is 313-364-1551. And if you guys didn't catch that, it is available down in the show description. And if you guys have some free time, don't forget to check out the awesome friends of the show, I Know Squatch, Snarly Out Natural Products, Crypto Theology, and Big Ape Threads. And our friends with affiliate links, Dimension Devices, Oregon-ite, and Sticker Mule, with additional discounts and credits available. More information on those is available down in the show notes. And every single thing that I mentioned throughout the show is all available in the link tree, which is also available down in those show notes. And with that, hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. Hope today's show has connected some dots in your own reality. And I'll catch you guys on the next one. Have a good night, everybody.
Reality isn't what it seems. Abductees taking aboard a craft with a tractor beam. Is life a simulation or an astral dream? Aliens travel through black holes in different galaxies. Life is a bizarre odyssey, with the mic talking about philosophy. Well, Bigfoot is stalking campers as a Wendigo walks through the woods of sharpened antlers, using a Ouija board to talk to the dead like a necromancer. There's so many questions and not enough answers. So if you're interested in mysteries and abnormalities, tune in and listen to Inquiries of Our